Good morning, everybody. If I can ask everybody to take their seats, we'll get started. Thank you. Thank you for being such a quiescent audience. Goodness me. It's not usually that way. Good morning, everyone. I'm Danielle Pletka. I'm the Vice President for Foreign and Defense Policy Studies at AEI. I have to confess to you up front, I'm here playing a purely ornamental role. I was very graciously asked to introduce this conference. I'm absolutely delighted that we are able to do this jointly with the Peterson Institute for International Economics. As all of you know, the question of Russian gas and of European security and of American foreign policy has really been front and center, getting knocked off the front pages by worse news from the Middle East from day to day, but nonetheless an enormously pressing, not just short-term, but medium-term and long-term challenge. And one of the reasons that you see me up here and not Kevin Hassett, who's our Director of Economic Studies at AEI, is because politics has taken such a strong place in the oil and gas environment in Europe and in Eastern Europe, and has really become a tool for the Russians to exert foreign policy sway over their neighbors without substantial resistance from either the Europeans or the United States. When Ben Zeiker, who is a scholar here at AEI, came our way to suggest that we do this and chatted with Leon Aaron, who's our Director of Russian Studies, I thought this was really an important thing for us to turn to. We're going to look at all aspects of this question, not just the foreign policy, but also the economic and energy aspects. And I think this is going to be a conversation that continues at the American Enterprise Institute. I know that we're planning on doing another big conference in the fall on this issue, when I hope that we will have some policy progress to report. And I say hope, I'm not actually persuaded that my hopes will be fulfilled. But I'm going to turn things over now to Desmond Lockman, a scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, who's going to introduce all of our panelists, and I want to thank all of you and all of them very much for being here today. With that, Des?
Thank you, Danny, and good morning, everybody. I'm delighted to be moderating this session on Russian gas and European energy security. And right at the start, I should compliment Ben Zeiker for having put this whole seminar together, and for the timeliness of this seminar. The seminar couldn't be more timely for a number of reasons. First, in the context of the Ukraine crisis, what we're seeing is Russia is not hesitating to use oil and gas as an instrument in achieving its objectives. Indeed, what we've seen over the last several months is Russia has increased the price of natural gas to Ukraine by something like 80%. It's insisted on being paid arrears. What this is doing is it's exerting huge pressure on the Ukrainian economy, which is already deeply in recession. It's going to be requiring additional international support to keep that together. Worse yet is what we're seeing is that Russia is threatening to curtail supplies of gas to Ukraine on June 17th. They made that kind of announcement. And this has huge significance in the sense that Russia supplies about 30% of Europe's energy supply. The gas coming from Russia fulfills 30% of Europe's gas needs. And this would, since the pipelines all pass through Ukraine, something like half of that gas comes through Ukraine. If there's a disruption in supply, this could have a very significant impact on not simply the Ukraine economy, but on the Russian economy. And then the third reason that I think that this seminar is timely is because of the events that we're seeing in Iraq, to which Danny alluded. One just has to recall that Iraq is the second largest OPEC produces something like 3 million barrels a day, and more important yet is Iraq is the country on which we're counting to supply increased oil production to meet needs over the next few years. So if we get the Iraq situation getting out of hand, we're really going to see huge pressure on international oil prices. We've already seen international oil prices increase by something like 15% since the beginning of the year. Brent now is at around about $114 a barrel. This could have a huge impact on the European economy and the global economy if those prices go out. So for those reasons, it seems that Europe really needs to reduce its energy dependence on Russia. There would seem to be at least three reasons why this would be the case. First is that dependence on Russia, if you get curtailment of supply from Russia, that could have an obvious impact on the European economy. The second is more in the geopolitical sphere. What we're seeing is Europe's dependence on Russia for a lot of its energy supply curtails its ability to act freely in the diplomatic sphere or in the sphere of sanctions to do something about Russia's revanchist policies. That we're seeing that in terms of U.S. trying to push sanctions, Europe is very reluctant to go ahead. And the third reason is just from a cost competitiveness point of view, Europe currently pays something like 3 times the amount that the United States does for gas. So there's a huge cost disadvantage in which Europe is. So for all those reasons, it would seem clear that Europe has to reduce the dependency. Now, many ideas have been floated as to how this could be done. You know, they range from Europe investing in gas terminals so that they can import gas from alternative sources, for Europe to increase the interconnector lines, because what we've got in Europe is some countries are a whole lot more dependent on Russian gas than others. I'm thinking of the Baltics, places like Bulgaria, Slovakia, and so on. So that would help. Developing shale and gas would be another reason. Ben is going to talk about bringing into production mothballed coal production facilities in Europe. So there are many different options, but I'm looking forward very much to hearing what the panelists that Ben has put together have got to say on this topic. This particular panel will go in the following order. First, we'll start with Leon Aaron, who's a real Russian expert. As Danny's mentioned, he heads the Russian Studies program at the AEI, produces the AEI's Russian Economic Outlook, author of 3 widely acclaimed books on Russia. We'll then turn to Anders Aslund, who's an internationally renowned expert not only on Russia, but on Eastern Europe as well. Anders is the author of 13 books, many scholarly articles, and he's also served at different times as an advisor to the Russian government and to the Ukrainian government. And then last but not least, Ben Zeiker, my colleague at AEI, who's the John Searle chair, and is focused very much on energy and environmental matters. So with that, I'll turn to Leon Aaron.
Absolutely.
Everybody can see on their agenda that my colleague from the Peterson Institute was intended to introduce the second panel, and in fact that was just my misunderstanding, and he has to depart, unfortunately, and I do want to give him an opportunity to say just a word or two before we turn to our panel. So Marcus, I'm terribly sorry, but he's the Executive Vice President of the Peterson Institute and their Director of Studies. So now everybody's going to pay very close attention because I committed such a horrible, rude blunder at the beginning. So please come up and take the mic for just a moment.
No, thank you very much. There's just been a fair amount of confusion about the moving parts of this event. in Vladimir Putin's Russia, there's a certain Soviet-era revival to it, and I was feeling like the guy, the figure who gets airbrushed out of the picture. But I guess we've been inserted back in. Earlier this month, our institution released a new book, Confronting the Curse, the Economics and Geopolitics of Natural Resource Governance. And in it, Cullen Hendricks and I argue that petrostates, countries whose net oil exports exceed 10% of GDP, engage in militarized conflicts 50% more frequently than comparable non-petrostates. And while those results are for oil, it is likely that one might expect gas, for which it is more difficult to access alternative sources of supply in case of supply disruptions, and hence increases the efficacy of embargoes, to be even more prone to politicized abuse. And indeed, we find that high prices are associated with these militarized conflicts. Indeed, high prices embolden the petrostates. So while the recent events that Des alluded to in the Ukraine are highly regrettable, as Cullen Hendricks, my co-author, observed, in a narrow parochial sense, Vladimir Putin did us all a great, or at least did us a great service by underlining the topicality of our work. And indeed, we find that Russia comes by its reputation for petro-aggression quite honestly. It was the single most conflict-prone country in our sample. So the presumption is strong that Danny is absolutely correct, that the topic today reflects some very basic fundamentals in political economy and not simply the manifestations of sort of recent maneuverings between Moscow and Kiev. So we are indeed very happy and honored and excited to collaborate with the American Enterprise Institute on this event, and which I'm sure is going to be very important and interesting, and I look forward to the proceedings. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Des, Danny. On October 24th, the year of 1570, the Russian Tsar Ivan IV, better known as the Terrible, wrote a letter to a person he called his dearest sister. That dearest sister was Queen Elizabeth of England. The letter touched on all sorts of issues in the relations between two countries, including duty-free trade, which Ivan alleged English merchants abused to the detriment of their Russian counterparts. Here's how this letter ends. We thought that in your state you are the sovereign, and you yourself own and maintain your sovereignty and care for your state's benefits. But it seems that besides yourself, other people own your state, and not just employees of the state, but simple traders who don't care about the honor and benefit of the country, but seek only profit. And you, meanwhile, behave like a simple maid that you are. Now, one would think that, this was just an intemperate note in trade negotiations between two countries, not to mention Ivan the Terrible's terribly incorrect sexism. But look at the context in which this letter, the writing of this letter occurred. Ivan IV at that time was engaged in the building of a modern Russian state. And not just any state. It was a third Rome. It was the Holy Russia, the sole remaining embodiment and guardian of the only correct Christianity, which is, of course, the Orthodox Christianity. That state was to become the defender and protector of Orthodox believers anywhere. And if this sounds familiar, it should, because I intended it to. In the past 2 years, but especially since the Crimean annexation, Russian messianism is back, Russia as a unique civilization is back, and the defense of ethnic Russians, no matter where they are, is also back. Now, if we're shocked at how 19th century Vladimir Putin's Russia is, think of the grandfather of Ivan the Terrible, Ivan III, who at the very beginning of the 16th century went to war with Lithuania and continued that war for 4 years, from 1500 to 1503, ostensibly to defend the Russian Orthodox subjects of Lithuanian kingdom that he claimed were abused by Lithuanian authorities. Now, of course, Ivan the Terrible succeeded in constructing the modern Russian state, and he established the Russian monarchy with its seat permanently in Moscow. So the Duchy of Moscow, the Grand Princes of Moscow, became the Moscow Empire, and the Grand Princes became czars. Now, the costs were enormous, including almost incessant wars in the east and the west, the devastation of central Russia, mass immigration, a simple flight of peasants as far away from Moscow as they could, and of course the terror. Yet in Ivan's mind, the creation of this new state and the monarchy that came with it was worth the price, that price or perhaps any price. And to me, at least, the meaning of his reprimand to Elizabeth is precisely that she allowed the concerns about economic benefits to interfere with what Ivan the Terrible called the honor and the benefit of the state. Now, there are all kinds of indications pointing to Vladimir Putin's intention to construct a messianic, assertive, perhaps even revanchist regime centered on the recovery of geostrategic assets lost in the Soviet collapse. And such a regime, with Vladimir Putin as its president for life, I should add, would be inspired by the ideology of national exclusivity Putin articulated in the last couple of months, centered on 4 elements: Russian Orthodox religion, Russian ethnicity, opposition to the so-called Western values, and a strong authoritarian state. Now, although the price Russia has paid for this endeavor has not yet in any way approached the price of Ivan the Terrible's building of the Russian state, nevertheless, it has been quite substantial, and most importantly, just as it was, as was the case with Ivan the Fourth, that price seems to be quite acceptable to Vladimir Putin for the same reason it was acceptable to Ivan, because the honor of the state and his plans for that state were at stake, and they were worth the price. Let me just give you a few examples. On this past April, such a reliable source as the Financial Times published an article under a title, "Gazprom cannot afford another supply shut-off to Ukraine." And yet, on June 16th, that's precisely what Russia did. Now, this was just the beginning, and not even the largest costs associated with what, to me, appears to be a domestically driven, kind of more or less permanent, low-intensity campaign of Russia against Ukraine. And we could go into the details of what Lenin called one step forward, two step backwards, various maneuverings, Putin's rhetorical support for negotiations and the peaceful solutions, which surprisingly, never come to anything real, and apparently ignored by those whom he pays and trains and directs in Ukraine. Now, let me count the ways in which Russia has already incurred substantial economic losses from its policy in Ukraine. And the losses are twofold. One, of course, from Russia's sanctions on Ukraine. And by the way, Ukraine is the 3rd largest recipient of Russian exports and the 4th largest importer to Russia. The Russian exports to Ukraine are between $27 and $29 billion, or about 1.4 of Russian GDP. It's not a trifle, and yet it appears to be even under a greater threat, because as Putin said last week to the meeting of the agricultural producers in Stavropol, he would definitely impose tariffs, at least tariffs, if not the termination of trade with Ukraine after Ukraine, tomorrow as expected, is going to sign the associative agreement with the European Union. Now, this is extremely important also for this very touchy political reason. Russia imports overall about 40% of its food from the EU countries, and in 80%, in the case of larger cities, 80% of food is imported. Putin complained about that a few years ago in a speech. Now, the ruble is at its record low. It's somewhat rebounded, but was it a couple of months ago at its record low, not just against the dollar, but more importantly against the euro. Some staples, milk, chicken, meat, especially meat, went up to 10%. And yet, according to Putin, the single largest, apart from the European Union, single largest importer or exporter of meat to Russia, Ukraine, is going to be subject to additional sanctions. Let me move closer to other systemic costs, because the actual costs of gas and oil, both in terms of the sanctions that Europe may impose at some point, and in terms of the shutoff of the exports of gas through Ukraine, are clearly substantial. But that's to me is the smallest part of the losses that Russia is prepared to take. The flight of capital and the drop in domestic direct investment both had started before Putin's Crimean escapade, but undoubtedly have been increased by the uncertainty that the markets feel, by possibility of sanctions. We had a record outflow of capital from Russia at $62 billion last year. Already this year, Russia exceeded that, and apparently on the way to a capital flight of $130 billion. Now, $62 billion of last year was already a record low if you don't count 1 year, 2008, 2009, during the financial crisis, where the Russian economy shrank by almost 8%. And yet, with all of this, Russia is proceeding with its current policies in Ukraine. The cost of Russo-Ukrainian trade I've already described. Russia is ready to sacrifice a very important partner for the recipient of its exports, and in turn the sender of quite a few of imports to Russia. Let me conclude on this point. There are moments in nations' histories where certain leaders, that if they are in place at that time, manage to persuade the people, for whatever time period there is, that there are goals and ideals worth sacrificing for, and that the nations in those moments are not guided by economic calculations, but by fears, hatreds, glory, pride, or anger. And no matter how wrong that may seem to an outsider, many regimes succeed in extending these moments in history, usually with considerable increase in terror and monopolistic propaganda, succeed in pushing the economic considerations to the back of the national consciousness. And it seems to me, as we're calculating both what Russia may do further and what we may do to influence its policy, I think it's useful to keep in mind that Vladimir Putin, at least thus far, has managed to create this moment in Russian national history. And if he has his way, that moment will extend for quite a while. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Leon. Anders.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to do this. Is it on? Yep. To do this together with Uber. Ooh, a hidden
It's
button.
new technology.
Yeah. It's a pleasure for me from the Peterson Institute to do this together with the American Enterprise Institute. And of course, Russian gas today is a big issue. Leon has just told you about the political side of it, and I will talk about the economic commercial side of Russia as a supplier of gas to Europe and Ukraine. And my bottom line is that Gazprom is commercially just about the worst big corporation in the world. So I want to expound on first how bad it really is, and you will be amazed when you see the pictures. And then I will touch up on why it is so bad. Leon developed the geopolitical side. I will also develop another side of it. Does it work? No.
There we go.
I did it in the wrong direction. That's the problem. So let me start with Gazprom's first failure. Gazprom exports gas almost only to Europe, and it does so through pipes. It is just as vulnerable as you can be. If Europe or Ukraine does not buy Gazprom's gas, Gazprom has nothing to do with that gas apart from keeping it in the ground. Gazprom has a massive capacity to produce, probably 150 billion cubic meters, that it doesn't use because it's unable to sell its gas. And as it is today, it's almost completely dependent on Europe. And then you immediately say, but what about this big China deal of $400 billion? Well, this would amount to 2.5% of Russia's exports each year, which is not much. And it would go through a specially built pipeline to China, which could only be used by China. So China would be a monopsonist against Russia. Would you, as a seller, want to be in that situation? No. So this is a very bad deal for Russia and a good deal for China. China will be the price setter because it has many different sources of gas, and Russia, that is Gazprom, will be the price tag. I should say that Gazprom is a publicly traded company of which the Russian government owns 51%. Then we look up on the European market, and you can see this is total energy consumption in the European Union. It has been stagnant or declining slightly from 2003, and it's not going up anytime soon because Europe with very high energy prices, that is high energy taxes, and good energy saving technology is saving energy rather than increasing its consumption of energy. A decade ago, it was widely believed that the superior gas would expand, but it has also been stagnant. It has not significantly increased its share of European gas production. And a major reason for this is, of course, this wonderful company called Gazprom. And Gazprom's second failure, it is exactly that Gazprom's share of EU imports falls steadily. And as a consequence of lacking demand, Russia has to keep its gas underground. It's not worthwhile to produce it. Gas is very difficult to store. If you can't sell it, you don't produce it. And as a consequence of this, its share of global gas production is falling. So let me show a couple of pictures of what this looks like. For some reason, people say that Gazprom supplies 1/3 of EU's imports of gas, which is not true. This is Eurostat statistics and measured in energy content, and it's only 25%, and it's falling steadily. So instead, you can see that Norway about which nobody talks, is increasing its share, and so is LNG. The dependency of Europe on Russia for gas imports are highly exaggerated. The market is declining, and Gazprom's share is steadily declining. And if we move over to global natural gas production, it's not better. You can see here that Russia's gas production today is not bigger than it was in 1990. This is as stagnant an industry as you can find. And consequently, Russia's share of global gas production has declined from 30% in 1990 to today about 17%. And what about the value of Russia's gas export? Here you see that picture. It is also stagnating. Admittedly, 12% of Russia's exports is not little, and this is almost $70 billion, but it is not all that important either. Oil is far more important for Russia. Oil is the all-dominant export item. And then let me happily move on to Gazprom's third failure. Not only is Gazprom losing out abroad, it's also losing out at home, because Russia actually has a certain gas market, even if it shouldn't be exaggerated. So the two companies that are taking market share from Russia is Novatek, which is a crony company. It's Gennady Timchenko is a major owner who's one of the 4 cronies that the US Treasury has sanctioned. And Rosneft is the state company now preferred by Putin. And Novatek is a very well-run company by any standard. Rosneft is a politically now more powerful company than Gazprom, and nothing is as badly run as Gazprom. So we are losing out. But most of all, Gazprom is losing out in Ukraine. Ukraine has been Gazprom's second biggest market, sometimes the first biggest market in terms of volume and in terms of price, competing with Germany. And now you are seeing that Gazprom, in its commercial wisdom, is cutting that market out. And here you can see how Gazprom's share of total gas production in Russia is declining. And then we come to the worst failure, that is Gazprom's commercial failure. Its market capitalization has fallen by 3/4 since May 2008, when it hit $369 billion. Today it's lingering at around $95 billion. And this is what it looks on a graph. And then we have 4 more Gazprom failures that I just take in passing. Gazprom has, of course, neglected the US shale gas revolution, which is for long denied was true. And just in case, Gazprom is strongly sponsoring all environmental movements in Europe so that they can work for the prohibition of exploitation of shale gas in Europe. They've been successful, for example, in the Czech Republic and Bulgaria. And it also ignored the global LNG revolution. It missed out on the Chinese market until now. And it has underestimated EU competition policy that it didn't think had any tooth, which now turns out to be wrong. And here you see how Russia is the 10th biggest producer of LNG in the world. And you might ask why Russia is producing so little LNG. But let me tell you, that is the wrong question. The right question would be, why is Russia producing LNG? And the answer is easy, because Shell, Royal Dutch Shell, had a concession on Sakhalin to develop LNG. It was not Gazprom itself that came up with the idea, and then Gazprom strong-armed himself into that project and demanded half of it. So this was through a nationalization of half of Shell's project. And then I come to the point, what Gazprom is really about. Leon gave you his answer, which I do not quarrel with, but I put it as number 2, geopolitics. I put something else on the first place, namely generating personal revenues to Kremlin officials. And by my calculations, that's about $23 billion or through overpricing. You should probably add asset stripping as an additional factor. But let me give you the simple Gazprom financials. This is what all share analysts look upon, and the picture is not pretty. The capital expenditure for the last 3 years averaged $46 billion. According to Sberbank's analysts, that is $35 billion too much. $11 billion would be perfectly sufficient. So then you wonder, what are these, and the net profits are only $40 billion a year. So this means that Russia's Gazprom, that has had the largest net profits in the world at times, more than ExxonMobil, has no free cash flow. So what do you do with the money? You take it, which is of course a very sensible attitude to money. So Gazprom does this by building unnecessary pipelines at 3 times too high a cost. And this overpricing of $23 billion to crony companies have now been sanctioned by the US. Most of these 18 companies, crony companies that the United States have sanctioned, are crony companies belonging primarily to Gennady Timchenko and to Arkady and Boris Rotenberg, and they are building pipelines for Gazprom that have no commercial value. And they are selling them at a massive price. You heard something similar with Sochi Olympics, $51 billion, where Boris Nemtsov assesses that $30 billion was at least went to corruption. Gazprom is doing this every year. This is the greatest money machine in the world to Putin and friends. So how do we call such a company? Well, we don't really call it a company. We call it an organized crime syndicate. So Gazprom should be seen as the greatest organized crime syndicate in the world. And therefore, commercial goals are not very important. And while geopolitics are important as a secondary goal. So let me just show you the Gazprom financials. And you can see here that for each year, capital expenditures, which is how you tap money from the company, exceed profits. And you can also see that the capital expenditures are increasing with the profits. So for example, for 2011, Gazprom had planned to begin with $27 billion of capital expenditure, but when they got more profit, what you do? You build more pipelines, that is, you shovel more money out through the door, which is the real activity, and the total investment ended up at $53 billion, or not investment, but capital expenditure. The money they threw away at their near and dear. So what does this look like? Here this is how it typically happens. Alexei Miller, the CEO of Gazprom, comes into Putin, and Putin asks, what new pipeline can you propose today? And Miller, Julie has a map with him so that they can look up on what pipeline he suggests that day. But the question you, of course, ask in the end is, do they have any vision? Can you really continue with this mass corruption, building pipelines because you can get 2/3 kickback on them, rather than doing something that is useful for the country? So what is my advice to Ukraine after this slight analysis of Gazprom? Hang in there, don't give up. Cancel the 2009 agreement with Russia, which gave Russia all benefits and Ukraine only obligations. This must be ended, and the European Union should insist here on creating a normal market. At present, what Russia offered as a price for the first quarter of this year, $268 per 1,000 cubic meters, while I think Belarus now pays 169. You know, a slight difference, depending on how close to the Kremlin you are. And 2 days into April, Russia all of a sudden raised the price to $385, and then 1 day later they increased it to $485. So this per 1,000 cubic meters, all the measurements. So this is a totally politicized and arbitrary business, and this cannot be accepted in any civilized business connections. So my view is that the Gazprom should simply be sanctioned as an organized crime syndicate on elementary money laundering rules rather than on political rules. Thank you.
Thank you, Anders. Ben.
Quite a viable option for increasing European energy security rather quickly, which not many people talk about because it seems to be unmentionable in polite society, but I think it's worth thinking about nonetheless. So a few data on the European Union and Russian natural gas, and I have a slight issue with Anders' numbers. In fact, I think it is the case, unless I'm looking at the wrong data sets, that relative to 2012 and 2013, Russian gas at about a little over 14 billion cubic feet a day was 31%, not merely 24%, of EU gas consumption. Between 2012 and 2013, EU gas imports from Russia increased by a fifth, while imports from Norway declined by about 4.5%, and from North Africa there was a 20% decline to only 6% of EU consumption among the EU 28. Here is just a chart that I lifted from The Economist after checking the Eurogas numbers, and these numbers are correct for 2012 at 24% for the EU as a whole, but in fact in 2013 that market share for Russia and the EU increased pretty substantially. So unlike the case for crude oil, gas dependence matters. There's no such thing as an embargo in the world oil market, and you're all, I think, quite familiar with this argument. In fact, though, with natural gas traveling through pipelines, predominantly in localized markets, threats are much more viable. Dependence matters under a number of conditions when non-economic incentives, such as those presumably driving Putin's behavior, influence gas supply behavior when contracts are hard to enforce, when contracts with sufficiently long terms are hard to negotiate, et cetera, et cetera. And in fact, over half of Russian gas travels through two major pipelines transiting through Ukraine, and that is something on the order of 15 or 20% of the gas consumed in Europe. And so various scenarios that we're all familiar with are wholly plausible. There can be cuts in Russian deliveries. The Ukrainians can divert supplies themselves. So gas dependence really doesn't matter in this context. The question then becomes, does Europe have any options in the short term, any leverage of itself? And I think the answer is yes, based upon review of the trade literature, discussions with industry insiders, etc. Western Europe has something a bit over 21,000 megawatts of coal-fired capacity that have been taken offline in the last decade or so for various reasons. And so let's just conduct a conceptual experiment. Last year, the EU generated about 182 billion kilowatt hours of electricity with gas, and that works out to about 3.9 billion cubic feet a day. Recall that Russian gas has about a 31% market share in the EU. If we just assume proportionality, we get about 1.2 billion cubic feet a day of Russian gas being used to generate electricity. Well, suppose we took out of that 21,000 plus megawatts of idle coal-fired capacity and fired up 10,000 megawatts of it to replace an equal amount of gas-fired capacity. So if we use some standard assumptions, that new coal-fired capacity returned to the grid would replace about 75 billion kilowatt hours of gas generation using about 1.6 billion feet a day, which is more than 10% of EU imports of Russian gas, which, as I mentioned a moment ago, is a little over 14 billion cubic feet a day. So how much would that matter? Well, if given that annual EU spending on Russian gas is roughly 53 billion, so Russian revenues would fall by about 6 billion per year, even assuming no downward price effects. Now, would that affect Russian policies? I'm inclined to agree with Leon that Putin is driven by a very different set of objectives, and so it probably, I think, would not affect Russian policies very much, but I think that's also kind of a side issue. The more central question here is the reduction in the Russian ability to engage in opportunistic behavior, to make threats. And it seems to me that adding coal-fired capacity and replacing gas-fired power generating capacity in Western Europe would have the effect of reducing the ability of the Russians to deliver threats, either with or instead of gas itself. So let's assume that each 1,000 megawatts of EU coal capacity would require both scrubbers and catalytic converters. My preferred objective, to be honest about it, is simply to let the prevailing winds blow the effluents into Russia. But that aside, let's just suppose we adopted US-type environmental controls. That would cost roughly $350 million for each 1,000 megawatt plant. So there'd be a one-time cost of about $3.5 billion. And those retrofits would take something on the order of 1 to 2 years, at least in principle, putting aside political delays and all the rest. Now, what about greenhouse gases, you ask? If we assume, again, a replacement of gas-fired power with an equal amount of coal-fired power, net greenhouse gas emissions would increase by about 80%. On a per megawatt hour basis, the increase would be, or per megawatt hour, the increase would be about 0.4 of a metric ton, again, per megawatt hour. So for 75 billion kilowatt hours, or 75 million megawatt hours, that increase in greenhouse gas emissions would be about 30 million metric tons each year. How important is that? Well, global greenhouse gas emissions, depending on which data set you look at, are between 35 and 49 billion metric tons per year. And so assume either figure, a coal gas substitution policy implemented by the EU, as I've just described, would increase global emissions by less than 0.1% annually. If we run that increase through the National Center for Atmospheric Research climate model, which is used by everybody who works in this area, the temperature effect in 2100 would be less than 7/10,000ths of a degree, even under the highest IPCC assumption about the sensitivity of temperatures to increases in greenhouse gas concentrations. Just as a point of reference, the standard deviation of the surface temperature record is about 1/10 of a degree. So that increase would not be measurable. So, in conclusion, note that European shifts toward coal already are taking place. German coal consumption has increased 13% since 2009, partially due to the economic recovery from 2008, partially as renewables have proven rather disastrous economically, partially in the wake of the 2011 nuclear shutdown in Germany of about 8,000 megawatts and further planned reductions of 12,000 megawatts by 2022. In the UK, the increase in coal consumption is 22%. I think this trend in Europe is likely to continue given U.S. industrial access to inexpensive gas, which will confront Europe with increasingly unfavorable industrial competitive conditions. Now, again, a notional EU electric generation shift in favor of coal as a substitute for gas is not very fashionable, but I think it's an option worthy of far more attention than it's received. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ben, and thanks to all the panelists for really provocative and interesting presentations. Before I turn it over to questions, which I'll do shortly, perhaps I could just ask a couple of questions just to get some clarity as to where we're going in this Russia-Ukraine European crisis. The question that I'd have to the panelists would be, how do they see the prospects for any resolution to the Russia-Ukraine crisis? You know, if I understand Leon correctly, Putin is motivated by matters other than economics. So does this lead us to a very dismal conclusion as to where we might be going in the crisis? I guess the second question I'd have is, what is the appropriate response by the United States and Europe in terms of sanctions? You know, if these sanctions aren't going to do much good in slowing them down, you know, should they nonetheless pursue it? I would have thought that the sanctions would have great costs to the United States and Europe, in the sense that we're not dealing with Iran here, we're dealing with a country that is really quite an important part of the global economy with strong financial linkages. So that would be my second question. You know, and the last question, I guess, would be directed at Anders, is do I understand him correctly in thinking that Russia doesn't have huge leverage over Ukraine, you know, in the sense that it is its major exporter, you know, and they can just proceed as they're doing in an extortionary way, just raising the gas price and threatening to cut it off? It would seem to me that Ukraine is in a very weak position in respect to Russia, but you know, I defer to an expert on this matter. So maybe if each
take it up.
just takes those three questions, and then we'll turn it over to questions.
Well, at least on the first two, there's excellent questions. What next in Ukraine? Again, if my perception is correct, and you know, I'll be happy to be wrong here for the sake of Russia and Ukraine. Russia's behavior, or let's call it what it is, a low-intensity war in Ukraine, is a corollary of its domestic political imperatives. In other words, to build the kind of regime that Vladimir Putin is building with himself as president for life, you do need this kind of on and off, low intensity conflict. You know, this is not news. This is authoritarians in history, starting from Sparta and ancient Greece, and all the way to Saddam Hussein and everybody else. Not to mention Stalin. I mean, you need a hostile environment to point to, both as an excuse for definitely lowering standard of living, which we're already seeing in Russia, see more of this, and also for the boost to the popularity of the leader, who is then positioned by the monopolistic propaganda, which we already have in Russia as far as the television is concerned, as the defender against all those dark forces that are gathered on the borders of the country. And so I think the pattern we're settling in Ukraine is something like this. Russia confronts Ukraine with a horrible moral dilemma. Either admit a foreign country's sovereignty over your territory, or try to reclaim the sovereignty, which will definitely undoubtedly lead to bloodshed, including civilian deaths. And so the situation is like this: the so-called rebel or separatists, who I don't think go to the bathroom without checking with Putin first, attack a high symbolically high value target, say like they did in airport in Donetsk. The Ukrainian forces trying to retake it. There are casualties on both sides, but also because this is urban warfare, and deliberately so by Moscow, casualties among the civilians. There's hue and cry in Moscow. Ukraine is accused of killing and butchering Russian speakers. Ukraine stops. It announces a unilateral ceasefire. Putin rhetorically definitely supports that unilateral ceasefire, ostensibly gives the order to the separatists to stop. Nothing, of course, happens. And then there is another attack, and we're back to where we were. And I think this is the pattern which I think is going to go on, unless Putin decides that you need to cash in that chip in exchange, and I'm talking about the southern and eastern provinces of Ukraine, in exchange for so-called federalization of Ukraine, which in effect will make those provinces Russia's protectorates, formally within Ukraine, but culturally, ideologically, economically, and politically, Russia. So that I'm afraid that we're settling with Ukraine. Now, in terms of sanctions, I didn't mean to say that Russia is impervious to sanctions. When I say that its behavior is rooted in something rather than economics, and it's something goes to the center of regime's perception of itself, legitimacy, and national pride, you could still influence this behavior. But what we need to remember is that if this analysis is correct, the sanctions will have to be directed not against specific policies of the regime, but against regime's legitimacy inside the country, and they will have to be for extremely long term. I mean, 5-10 years, because otherwise you cannot possibly get to with any effect to influence the behavior of Russia, given that superficially non-economic factors, superficial economic factors do not influence it. Let me just give one number that I forgot to give. Russia's annexation of, right off the bat, Russia's annexation of Crimea cost between $2 and $3 billion. There is a bridge that's being built, a direct bridge to Crimea from Russia. That's probably another $1 billion given the overcharges and corruption. And then finally, Putin's promises to raise pensions, sometimes by factors of 2 or 3, salaries, invest in Ukraine, invest in Crimea and so on and so forth, are likely to add even more to this bill. To pay for the annexation of Crimea this year, Russia is essentially arrested the private, non-state portions of people's pensions. There is an option to invest in private. And according to Alexei Ulyukayev, who is the Minister of Finance recently, that amounted to 243 billion rubles essentially taken out of people's private accumulation and spent on Crimea. That's about $8 billion, and I think the costs are mounting. So these are the length to which this regime is likely to go on in order to continue its policies on Ukraine. So if you do decide to go into sanctions, do it with no expectations of a quick return, and stay there for a long haul.
Thanks, Leon. Anders.
Thank you. I'll start on your second point, which is really the European Union. The European Union is strongly underestimated both in this city and in Moscow when it comes to competition policy. In competition policy, the European Commission holds its own, and that's the only area where the European Commission decides independently. And the European Commission has started a case against Gazprom about 2 years ago, and this is the biggest competition policy ever. And remember that Microsoft and Intel, among others, have been forced to pay fines of over $1 billion when being punished by the European Commission. What the European Commission tentatively asked for in fines from Gazprom is $15 billion, and they ask for a complete change of the business model. And this is highly relevant for Ukraine. Moving to the first point, the 2009 agreement between Russia and Ukraine is absolutely against the current EU competition policy. The first problem is that the prices in it are oil-linked, and gas prices heavily linked on the world market from oil, and therefore the Stockholm Arbitration Court regularly goes against, in its verdicts, Gazprom to the tune of several $billions each year, as various European gas companies quietly sue Gazprom and win. Secondly, this formula for Ukraine is clearly flawed, since Ukraine is supposed to pay higher prices than anybody else. So somehow the Ukrainians were cheated on it. A third problem is that Ukraine committed itself to a large volume of imports that it doesn't need. According to this take and pay clause, that means that even if you don't take the gas, you are supposed to pay for the full volume at the full price. And this is also regularly being thrown out in the Stockholm Arbitration Court. And fourthly, this agreement contains a prohibition against re-export, which is also against the EU competition rules. On top of that, it has a fixed price for transit through Ukraine, but there Russia commits to no volume. So it's a totally a biased agreement against Ukraine. It's also different timings on the different clauses from 1 to 10 years. So of course the Russians insist on maintaining this, and it should be thrown out. And I think that the EU, which acts here through EU Energy Commissioner Günther Oettinger as a mediator, will throw it out. The price is not such a big deal. Ukrainians now accept 326, and Russia wants $385 per 1,000 cubic meters, and make it $350, and both sides will be okay. That could be possible, probably should be a bit lower given how the market develops, as we have discussed. And then, of course, Ukraine should pay the arrears, but you don't pay the arrears before you have settled the price. So Ukraine has taken a volume of gas in April and May where there was never any agreement on the price. So that is up to be decided before that. Ukraine, of course, should not pay the arrears. So, and can Ukraine manage this? Yes, Ukraine can manage perfectly well without taking any gas, probably until the end of this year, because Ukraine has large volumes of gas stored, and Ukraine produces 40% of its gas needs in any case. On top of it, Ukraine should now undertake a big gas reform that has been agreed in the IMF standby agreement of March. So Ukraine should cut its consumption of gas by 40% in the next, say, 5 years. And meanwhile, it could increase its own production by 50%, both through conventional or shale gas. And in that case, Ukraine does not need any imports whatsoever. So in the medium term, Russia's position is extremely weak. In the very short term, it's also weak. But in a year's time or so, when it comes to the next winter, then Russia has a stronger position. So Russia has an interest of getting this settled. On the overall issue, my view is that Putin has strongly overplayed his hand with regard to Ukraine. And think of it like this, that Russia's GDP today is 6% of NATO GDP, which is the relevant entity. If you are then starting a war of expansion, you are in a very weak situation. You can compare with Nazi Germany in 1938. It was 38% of the European economy. So you can say that Hitler was much more rational going on expansion war than Vladimir Putin. Then, of course, you may say that perhaps Putin is not doing an expansion war. And then I say, sorry, South Ossetia, Abkhazia, and Crimea prove the point. If you have started on that track, you're not likely to stop. What we are seeing now in Donbass, to my mind, seems to be a mess. And it seems as if Putin has not decided what to do. And I hear from the Ukrainian government that they think that he had planned to do this in March 2015, when they feared that Yanukovych would lose the presidential elections, and that they were intent on intervening then. But he had only the plans for Crimea clear and set, and not for the rest of the country. This blow up of the trade union building in Odessa seems to have stopped one part of the intended Russian expansion towards Transnistria. And now it's limited to Donbass. It seems to be a big mess. And the Russian public statements that go against every sense of truth means that it's very difficult to take any Russian public statement seriously. And with the annexation of Crimea, Russia has violated half a dozen of the major ratified international treaties. So what meaning would it make to have another treaty with a government that persistently violates even ratified treaties? Thank you.
Okay, well, I'll keep this short in the interest of time. I'm rather dubious about sanctions, frankly. I don't think they work very well without enforcement by, pardon me? The light's on, anyway. Okay. I really don't think sanctions will work. Notice the French are just now delivering warships. I really cannot believe, particularly given in a time period when the European economies are not growing very well, that they will impose sanction or costs upon themselves in order to achieve lower gas prices for Ukraine. Doesn't strike me as all that plausible. I really do believe, I think I disagree a bit with Anders. I think, at least in the short term, Russia does have a good deal of leverage over Ukraine, regardless of the sins that can be laid at the feet of Gazprom. And I believe a much more fruitful policy for the U.S. and for Europe would be to find alternatives, both in the short run and in the medium term, to the use of Russian gas. refiring up coal-fired capacity, et cetera, exporting U.S. LNG as quickly as possible, and all the rest. I don't see really much of a much alternative to that, and that would have the salutary effect not only of helping Europe and Ukraine, but of weakening our friend Vladimir Putin in the medium term.
Thank you. Let me open it up to questions. If you could just identify yourself and...
I'm Barry Wood, an economics columnist. I'd like to ask about Mr. Putin's visit to Vienna this week. He signed this South Stream pipeline deal with the Austrians and the Italians, the Bulgarians, the Serbs. They all seem to want that. Is it significant that the South Stream pipeline seems to be going ahead, and do you see any prospect that the European Union, given that division, is going to move towards sanctioning the Russian gas industry?
Thank you. Anders.
Bulgaria and Serbia were forced out of their commitments to South Stream by the European Commission. This agreement yesterday in Vienna really came as a big surprise, that Austria would go that far. So this is a big fight within the European Union. And my suspicion is that it will not succeed. As I see it, the main purpose of South Stream is for President Putin to go around to various countries and give personal amounts of money to certain political leaders. And as Prime Minister, he did little traveling, apart from on the Balkans, to visit certain politicians in order to promote the South Stream. So when Gazprom builds pipelines, it's very personal. We see, for example, with Gerhard Schröder and on Nord Stream, and also former Finnish Prime Minister Paavo Lipponen. It's good to have good top politicians or former top politicians on it. In the Balkans, you don't need to go to former politicians. You can go to current politicians and provide them with what they most want, money. We can't prove exactly who has done what, but there are lots of suspicions out. And this is not an acceptable activity. I think that there will be serious legal issues raised because of such suspicions. And the European Commission in this case is the Energy Commissioner Günther Oettinger, who is quite tough and has a relatively strong mandate. So I don't think that this is the conclusion of it, even if it was a big turn in favor of the Russians we saw yesterday.
We've probably just got 5 minutes, so let me just group a few questions. Sir.
Thank you. This is to Leon Aaron. You've expressed the idea that Russia is acting now just how it acted in 1570. And on the other hand, Marcus Noland said that he expounded the idea that petroleum states act in a particular way. So is Russia acting more like it always does, or is it acting like a petroleum state?
Thank you. Let's just group it anyway. At the back there.
I'm Branko Terzic, a former commissioner on the U.S. Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. So my question is about the pipelines. Historically, when the original contracts were written between Russia and the European Union, there was no other supply of gas. And so it was a bundled contract of combination of delivery and gas at the border, and take or pay was common. It was common in this country, but it was take or pay to finance the pipeline more than to finance the construction. My question is, if you have a Russian pipeline coming to the border of a European Union country, at the border, how does the European Union extend its authority into Russia to require them to unbundle a pipeline? Couldn't they just treat the point of entry as if it was a gas well and proceed with negotiations there? Thank you.
Thank you. Just take one last question.
Thank you. I'm Alex Pimenov with the Voice of America. And my question refers to the sphere of political analysis. Don't you think that given all these developments around Ukraine and in Ukraine and between Russia and Ukraine, one should really very seriously, seriously revise the understanding of the very nature of the Russian regime that developed within the last 20 years? Thank you.
All right, let me take it quickly the first questions on, because they're very similar. I think that's exactly right. I think there are signs that Putin, from his re-election on, is revising some fundamentals of the state. It's evolving from a relatively soft internationalist authoritarian state to a much harder, more traditional authoritarian state where the opposition is now not just marginalized, but also intimidated and stigmatized. Attack on the civil society, well, you know all those laws adopted after his re-election, much more repressive, but also messianic and aggressive. And the basis, like I said, Putin pretty much declared that Russia is a unique civilization, and it has its own laws, and it has its own mission in the world, and it's based on these four whales of Russian ethnicity, Orthodox Church, strong authoritarian state. And so this I think is where he's taking Russia, and it's definitely a marked evolution of the regime. And I think the Crimea and the Ukrainian situation there partly was caused by the events outside Putin's control, but as Anders interestingly confirmed, it was a state that pretty much was prepared to do it already. So I think it is a watershed, and I think my biggest concern, frankly, with all due respect to Ukraine, is not what's happening between Russia and Ukraine, but what's happening inside Russia.
Thank you. First, the question on pipelines. You're of course right that the European Union has no authority on Russian territory, but Gazprom owns half of the pipelines in rather many countries in the area in between, and at least Ukraine has subscribed to the European energy community. I think also Moldova and Georgia, and that means that they accept the whole energy competition policy of the European Union. They have committed themselves to dividing transmission and production of various kinds of energy. So the European Union can push hard in that fashion, and Gazprom complains massively, including President Putin himself, that this is confiscation of Gazprom's property in the various EU countries where they own pipelines. On the question of revise the nature of the Russian regime, I would argue that we are seeing four different Putin regimes. The first one, during his first term, was authoritarian, but fully market liberal. The second, from 2004 to 2007, was state capitalism. The informal third term was asset stripping, focusing on taking as much as possible out of a state company to the Timchenko, Rotenberg, Kovalchuk companies. And then I think that what we are increasingly seeing now is sheer arbitrariness. I showed intentionally this picture of Putin and Miller, because this is how decisions are made now. They are not made by the government. The government is irrelevant. But you have Sechin or Miller or the railway chief, Yakunin, coming to Putin with a multi-billion-dollar proposal, and Putin, without going through proper procedures, signs off on it. So this is really the worst kind of arbitrariness. The picture I show you, this was the Yakutia Far East gas project, which costs at least $55 billion, probably $65 billion or more. And this is decided like this by Putin now. So this is what happens when you're going down.
Ben.
Yeah, just very briefly, the only petrostate in the world that matters is Saudi Arabia, and their behavior and Russian behavior in natural gas markets very different. And even in terms of Russia, Russia's behavior in the world oil market is very different from its behavior in the gas market in Europe, simply because of differences in the degree to which they can engage in opportunistic behavior. I think the take or pay problem is really much less important than a lot of people assume. From a consuming nation's standpoint, gas not taken today can be taken tomorrow. And so the only real issue is the interest on the early payment. And that, I think, is a good deal less important than a lot of people assume.
Thank you very much. I think we'll now move to the second panel, but beforehand, I'd just like to thank our panelists for what I thought was a great discussion.
Okay, why don't we get started so we can get out on time for the game. My name is Mark Perry, and I'm a resident scholar at AEI and a professor of economics at University of Michigan in Flint. I'd like to thank my colleague Ben Zeiker for kind of being the driving force behind the event today, and also thank the Peterson Institute for co-sponsoring the event. So we're switching now from the political dimension to the policy dimension, and we've got a panel of 3 speakers. I'll introduce them briefly, and then they'll share their thoughts with us. Tim Bursma is a fellow of the Energy Security Initiative and the Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institution, and his research focuses on energy policy coordination, energy security, gas infrastructure and regulation, resource scarcity, and unconventional natural gas extraction. Before becoming a full-time academic researcher, Tim spent 5 years in the private sector working as a corporate counsel to the electricity production sector in the Netherlands. Then we have Gary Huffbauer, who's been a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute since 1992. He was formerly a director at the Council on Foreign Relations, professor of international finance diplomacy at Georgetown, deputy director of the International Law Institute at Georgetown, deputy assistant secretary for International Trade and Investment Policy of the U.S. Treasury, and director of the International Tax Staff at Treasury. He's written extensively on international trade, investment, and tax issues, and has co-authored 16 books. Then Gary Schmidt, my colleague, is a resident scholar at AEI and co-director of AEI's Marilyn Ware Center for Security Studies and director of AEI's program on American citizenship. Previously, Gary was a staff director of the U.S. Senate Select Committee on Intelligence and executive director of President Reagan's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board. Gary's security work focuses on longer-term strategic issues that affect America's security at home and its ability to lead abroad, while his work in the area of citizenship focuses on challenges to maintaining and sustaining a strong civic culture in America. He's written and co-authored at least 6 books and has a PhD from the University of Chicago. So we'll start with Tim.
Great, thank you. Thanks for the kind introduction, and thanks for coming back. I appreciate that some of you have left, because indeed in this country everybody believes they can win. As my fiance is Portuguese, I'm sure you'll appreciate that I don't believe you can win. But I wish you all the best for the game. So I'll say a few words first about what I'm working on at Brookings at the moment, and what is relevant, of course, to the debate you're having today. Beg your pardon? There are slides, yes. Oh, there. These are not them. Are they somewhere? in the queue, or how does that work? There they are. Yes, good. Thank you. Let me say a few words about myself. So this presentation, I want to say a few words about what I'm working on now. I want to say a few words about energy security in Europe. Then I'd like to say a few words about where energy policy in Europe stands today, and I'll give you an outlook, and that will be the conclusion at the same time. My personal background was touched upon earlier, so I don't have to mention it. At the moment at Brookings, we're working on a number of projects that I think are relevant in view of the debate we're having today. One, we're doing a number of scenario studies about the future of gas supplies in Europe, and we're working with the Energy Research Institute in Moscow, and one of our senior non-resident fellows who has a decades-long career in the European gas industry. Our main hypothesis is that, and I think we are very close to the data that Ben referred. Indeed, Russian gas will be very competitive in Europe, at least until the end of the decade. That is to say that natural gas in general will be less competitive than coal, of course. So the share of coal, as was referred to earlier, has been rising and will continue to rise at least until the end of the decade, and some people believe even longer. We believe that of the natural gas used in Europe, an increasing share will come from Russia as indigenous resources are declining, as the ability of Norway to increase its production are limited, and as production in Algeria has declined dramatically. And moreover, there is, as some of you will know, a very significant amount of regasification capacity already in place. Europe can import about 160 BCM today. So those plants are there. They're heavily underutilized. Some of them are at 10% or so. One of them is the Gate terminal in Rotterdam, which is very close to idle at the moment. So it has not much to do with capacity being in place, but with simple market economics, and prices dictate that LNG is not competitive in Europe at the moment, and we think that's going to last for quite a while, at least a number of years. So anyhow, this is something we're working on, and we hope to produce a number of papers by the end of the summer and then following the course of the fall. So my dissertation will be published by Routledge. This will be next year. I'm handing in my manuscript, but it's about European gas market integration, or the lack thereof, and what effects that has on European energy security. And then finally at Brookings, we're doing a project on Eastern Mediterranean natural gas, which may be relevant, as it is often mentioned as one of the alternative sources to Russian gas, although I would argue that it's all pretty preliminary to draw any far-reaching conclusions on that matter. On to first energy security in Western Europe, and I think it's important to make this distinction between East and West. As in my debate since I got here in the United States, it seems to me there's a lot of misunderstanding about how Europeans view energy security, and I think there's in general I guess more appreciation for the Eastern European approach to energy security, which sees energy not as a commodity but also as a security issue. In Western Europe, energy resources are very much seen as a market issue, something that you can address by making markets function, and I think they have a good case to make there. In Eastern Europe, that's different, although at least in words. I'm not sure in deeds whether that's the case too, but I will get back to that in a minute. So first in Western Europe, and I would include Italy, there's large demand of all the natural gas consumed in Europe. 85% is consumed in this part of the market. So it gives you an indication of relevance in terms of demand and yeah. So you have significant market development. You have a lot of infrastructure, storage facilities, LNG regasification capacity, and by and large, very stable relations with Russia. I mean, energy relations go back a number of decades, and the larger part of Europe has not suffered from any supply disruptions and has had, globally speaking, fairly competitive prices. I think the comparison is sometimes made with North America and the United States. We think that the comparison with Asia is much more relevant, as that's the other large region in the world that imports a lot of energy resources. And so that would be a much more sensible comparison the way I see it. So in recent years in Northwestern Europe, successful market integration, partly as a consequence, or to a large extent as a consequence of European policies that I will get back to in a second. You have interconnectors, reverse flow options, so gas can flow in each direction, so you're resilient to potential supply shocks. And you see now increased hub trading To give an example, about over half of the volumes that are treated in the Netherlands today are traded on the hub and no longer in long-term contracts. And then finally, several member states, as you all know, are at the forefront of a push for a low-carbon economy, where Europe has a fairly ambitious policy in place for a number of years. So then we move to Eastern Europe, where it's a different story. I guess with the exception of Romania, I'd say that demand is insignificant. It's very small, even in a large country like Poland. Consumes only 640 BCF per annum, which is very limited. Of all the electricity generated in Poland, over 90% is coal-fired, so natural gas is not very important. And so because of this, and because it is not very attractive for marketplace to sell their produce there and compete with Russia, or with Russian Gazprom, I should say, there's a lack of security of supply. Most of these countries have one supplier. There's very limited reverse flow. There's not a lot of investments in infrastructure and interconnectors and so on and so forth. And so there's a lack of competition, and obviously that leads to arbitrary pricing. And this is what we've seen in a number of these states. The third remark about the European Commission only partially delivering after 2004, prior to the accession of the 10 new member states, which were almost all of them the Eastern European member states in 2004, essentially there are always accession talks about what are we going to do together, how are we going to work together, and the large share of coal and the lack of natural gas in the fuel mix in these countries was on the agenda. Given the ambitious climate policies, Europe really wanted these countries to move away from their coal use and use more natural gas, and they were promised that they were going to be helped with this. But of course, at the end of the day, European Commission has very limited ability to actually help there, has limited power in terms of policy making and financial means as well, and so it could not deliver. And this is something that Eastern European member states are not pleased about until to date. So on the other hand, I would say it's very unclear to me, and having spent quite a bit of time in Eastern Europe, unclear to me why national governments haven't taken more action themselves to harness themselves against market abuse by Gazprom. Of course, this could have been done in the case of Poland. I've often wondered why Polish authorities did not invest in interconnectors with Germany, so it would have access to alternative gas from the Netherlands, from Norway. Polish authorities even could have decided to build a pipeline to Denmark. It would have been far more cheaper than constructing a multi-billion-dollar LNG terminal, which is now being constructed and will come into force later. The effect of these policy decisions is that Poland will attract alternative supply, but it will be vastly more expensive than Russian gas. This will be Qatari LNG, allegedly sold at about 150% of prices that Russia charges, that Gazprom charges in Poland. And so the Polish authorities will have to regulate these prices because they don't want their consumers to pay more at the end of the day. Now, this is an example of, what this is behavior that, the way I see it, does not correspond with a country or government that sees Russia as a serious threat. Actions don't match the threat as it is at least portrayed. And then finally, renewable energy, as I'm sure you all know, is in this part of the continent more seen as economic harm than anything else. And here the security element, argument, which you can also make for renewable energy, of course, is apparently not valid. So we'll move to energy policy where it is today. There have been attempts to draft sort of a European energy policy since the Declaration of Messina in 1955, well, as you all know, these attempts have only had mixed results so far. Let's put it like that. There's two policy areas where European Commission does have a significant mandate. One, and it was touched upon earlier by Anders, market functioning, I guess. So several packages to liberalize electricity and gas markets were issued. Throughout the late 80s. The last package should have been implemented by mid-2012. Then on the other policy area where Europe has a large mandate is, of course, climate and renewable policy, where ambitious policies are in place and successors are being discussed and probably decided upon later today or tomorrow. So only recently, and I think this is important, did the European Commission also receive a mandate to invest, to better streamline national regulatory regimes and to co-invest in energy infrastructure. And the way I see an energy market, you have suppliers and markets, and you have infrastructure and regulation, and all these factors need to come in play. and together can make a market function. Now, essentially, the asynchrony that you see here in policy making, so the European Commission having a mandate on market functioning and not much on energy infrastructure or streamlining regulation, that asynchrony, I think, negatively affects EU gas market and electricity market functioning to date. So this is why we are then now, Europe essentially being a gas market under construction. And so there's a difficulty, lack of financial means to invest in so-called projects of common interest. When this policy proposal was adopted in 2011, 248 projects for energy infrastructure were listed. And this gives you an indication of the massive investments that are needed to make both electricity and gas markets work. The available budget until 2020 for all these projects is 5.85 billion euros, which is a fraction, really, of what is needed. The estimates are that 200 billion euros are needed to make this work properly. Another problem is that existing legislation is not always implemented throughout the EU. As an indication of this, in late 2012, infringement procedures against 14 member states were pending who had not implemented existing legislation, and so you get this patchwork of national regulatory regimes, which is not attractive for suppliers, of course, who sell their produce and makes competition, and again, the emphasis here ought to be on Central and Eastern Europe, makes competition very difficult, unattractive, and so it doesn't happen, and you continue to be in a situation where you have a dominant supplier. So you need significant market reforms. This regulatory framework continues to develop, and the uncertainty stays. So in my view, market completion will take a number of more years, and not as the European Commission had promised and set itself a goal this year. It will wait for a new commission that will come on board in fall to draw that conclusion, but you can be fairly certain that will be the conclusion. So 2014, not realistic at all. I'll sum up. So in light of Ukraine, I think what we'll see is an increased interest in the projects of common interest that were mentioned earlier. The list of 248 projects has been narrowed down to 33 critical projects. May even be a little more money available, who knows? Will it be enough? No, it will not. And second, the 2030 policy framework for climate and energy that I referred to earlier will likely be adopted in some form, although it's highly controversial in Europe, with Western Europe being ambitious about this and Eastern Europe not. The bottom line is that there will be probably a 40% carbon reduction target for 2030 and a 27% renewable energy target, although these details may change last minute, but today and tomorrow the European Council is likely to decide about this. Possibly delayed construction of South Stream, we'll see. I think eventually it will get built. And then finally, I guess, absent substantial intervention, I think that what remains is disagreement about who's going to pay for energy infrastructure in Europe. The regulatory uncertainty, as I described, will continue, will persist. And so I also don't think, having seen so far what I've seen in Eastern Europe, that structural reforms will take place, price regulations will be taken away, and so on and so forth. And so I think in that part of the continent, single source dependence will continue, and unfortunately that market abuse will likely be a consequence as well. So I think this is where we are, and again, despite absent of substantial and real policy intervention, this process of muddling through, the way I see it, will continue for a number of years. Thanks.
Thank you, Tim. We'll now hear from Gary Huffbauer.
Thanks very much, and I want to echo the thanks to Ben Zeiker, who really organized this program this morning. So here you have a snapshot of the EIA projections of our production and trade. Pretty big increases thanks to the shale revolution. We could become a net exporter of LNG by 2016 and sharply reduce our imports of crude oil. LNG exports could range up to 20 billion cubic feet a day. Now, so that's a kind of a little picture of the natural gas trade. And you can see how the imports are declining, and a lot of the LNG facilities have been converted to, or are being converted to, exporting as opposed to importing. And the trade balance in LNG is obviously going towards zero. if we look at the crude oil and petroleum picture, you know, it has some echoes of the same feature. The U.S. has been a net exporter of petroleum products for some period of time. Not big numbers, but a net exporter. This is gasoline and diesel and aviation fuel. But you can see that the crude oil negative position, which is has been a long feature of the U.S. Economy, is slowly getting less negative. So turning to the regulatory side of things, you've got two bureaucracies to tell us whether or not we can export LNG, the Department of Energy and the FERC, and I guess there's a FERC representative in the room nodding, so we can toss all the difficult questions to him. There were a lot of applications submitted to the DOE. Under the U.S. Legal structure, which dates back to the U.S.-Canada Free Trade Agreement, any exports to FTA partners are almost automatically approved, but non-FTA partners require sort of a national interest test. There have been 7 companies received a kind of conditional public interest test, but only one, at Cheniere, has received the green light from both DOE and FERC. That's the LNG story. Now, there's a proposal, a Department of Energy proposal, to streamline the licensing process. This is quite recent, just in late May. They have all these applications to approve LNG exports, and they were previously taking them according to the order in which they were filed, and now they're supposedly going to prioritize them to those which are of greater commercial interest and give more complete access to the public. There's been some people think this might be an improvement, might speed things up. Others are pretty skeptical. The House is considering a bill which would impose a 90-day timeline on the DOE for reviewing these applications. Of course, that's just a bill, nothing in law yet. What about crude oil exports? Well, we're now a leading producer, again, thanks to the shale, of light crude oil. And these controls on crude oil exports, they go back to the 1970s and the oil shock. Everybody recalls that. Right now, given that there's a certain amount of debate on the LNG exports, the political appetite for further liberalizing crude oil exports is not zero, as developments just in the last 2 days have shown, but it's not probably as strong. So in all of that, what about the U.S. commitment to Europe? Well, there's concerns over energy dependence on Russia. There was some statement in the March 2014 summit on cooperation and prospects for LNG exports. All this talk is somewhat short of EU's hope for a much stronger declaration. Let me now expand on this last point on the cautious. I drafted this before, the announcement yesterday or the day before. What rationale can you construct for the way the Obama administration is operating on this or anything else? But let's just confine it to LNG and oil. They are, as far as I can see, trying to make everyone a little bit happy and no one too mad at them. So in the LNG story, you have 4 competing interests. You have the industrial users led by Dow, but there are other companies as well, who would just like to keep LNG in the U.S. because the price will be lower, they get cheaper feedstock, they're happy as clams. So that's one strong pressure group. Then you have the environmentalists who the strong environmentalists are the most, ideologically driven, really don't want anything that encourages fossil fuel anyway. So every avenue you can use to stop any development of fossil fuel of any kind, that's a good thing in their book. So they don't want any LNG, they don't want any pipelines, they don't want any of this, don't want shale. So that's group number two. And then of course you have the gas producers, the shale producers, and of course they want to be able to export to get some of that gap between the very low U.S. prices and the very high prices in Asia and Europe. And then finally, of course, you have the European story, or the foreign buyers more generally. Before Europe, it was Japan. Japan really wanted the U.S. to, or it still wants the U.S. to liberalize, as do other Asian countries. And these foreign countries, and EU in particular, they want it for the competitive. They want a U.S. signal of support and open markets and so forth, which would be consistent with U.S. trade policy more generally, and consistent with U.S. rhetorical support of Europe in the Ukraine crisis. But they don't have any illusion that anything would happen quickly. I mean, even if all the approvals were granted, the conversion of these LNG plants takes a couple of years, a couple $1 billion. It's a big thing, long-term contracts, transport facilities, and so forth. So in the short term, what Ben Zeiker proposed in terms of coal, the short term being 1 or 2 years, is much more practical than some of the other things that were just mentioned. But they do like the political signal. They do want the political signal. So these are the four groups which are competing on LNG. And what does the Obama administration do? Well, it gives a little bit to each of them. And that's what's happened. Now, on crude oil, it's pretty much the same story in terms of the four competing, and the outcome is pretty much the same. The only difference is that here, the protective interests which don't want to export are the refiners. Valero, particularly, you saw anybody read the Wall Street Journal, you see their share price dropped by 8% on that notice. The notice is not a complete blanket approval of crude oil. It's just some kind of light crude which has some, it's a very low amount of processing gone into it, and the administration says the Commerce Department acted on its own. I doubt that, but I think it's just kind of, trying to make everybody a little bit happy, and they made the refiners quite unhappy, but the environmentalists have their same position. Of course, the oil producers want, and Europe wants, again, the signal. So that's where we are in the policy, and I suppose what we see is what we will get, that is gradual liberalization in the remaining period of the Obama administration. Nothing very dramatic, unfortunately, but not completely shutting off the export opportunities. So that's kind of the end of my remarks, but I want to apologize. I have to leave promptly at 12, unfortunately not to watch the game, but I have a previous engagement which was scheduled long before we knew the schedule on the game, so I will have to leave, but thank you.
Thank you, Gary. Now we'll have Gary Schmidt.
Thanks, Mark. Well, thank you for hanging around, at least till 12. I have the dubious honor of going last after two panels of very fine presentations, and it's always hard to find something else to say when so much has already been put on the table. I'm also restricted by the fact that I'm not an economist and I'm not an energy expert, and so I'm going to try to talk about things that overlap with those issues, but are done from a kind of political and perhaps larger strategic perspective. Although again, as the previous panel did a very fine job of raising those issues as well. So one of the questions when I was thinking about the panel is what would I say? And one option I want to talk about is how much Europe can help itself when it comes to natural gas supplies, and thereby reduce its dependence on Russian supplies. And partially it has to do with developing their own gas reserves. which, when it comes to, just as in the United States, not as large, but the truth is continental Europe and the UK have substantial amount of shale gas reserves that could, in theory at least, reduce dependency if these reserves were developed. But of course, there's a kind of general pessimism about the ability to tap into those reserves. Let me go through a few examples. Of course, everybody remembers a few years ago there was a great deal of excitement about Polish shale gas, and for a variety of reasons, it turns out that those reserves are not technically recoverable in the same extent that the people thought. So you've gotten a few companies still hanging around trying to tap in, but some of the major companies have also pulled away. The Germans, who have actually been doing fracking for a number of years, have a ban on shale gas fracking moving forward. That's part of the coalition agreement that was settled before the new government took place in 2013, towards the end. In France, you have actually a significant amount of shale gas potential. I think actually probably the largest amount in Europe. But again, the French government has banned tapping into those resources. One would like to think that it's for high reasons of environmental cause, but in reality it typically has to do with the fact that France still wants to be able to sell nuclear reactors around the world, and so the last thing it wants to do is promote natural gas exploration and shale gas in particular. And then Ukraine also has an immense amount of shale gas potential, but it will not come to market until Ukraine is able to straighten out its own domestic gas pricing system, which perhaps the IMF can help it do or force it to do, but it's going to come at a great deal of cost because it'll mean a very immature, very unstable new government will be asking the population to take on higher prices and at a time when its economy is obviously not doing well, and it won't be doing well for some time. In the UK, you have a government that actually is headed towards trying to take advantage of the shale gas resources and reserves that it has. The difficulty in the UK is that the population is diametrically opposed, and so now you have this game going on where the government is promising all kinds of inducements, building projects for local communities to be able to bribe them off so that they can get to the gas. Whether this will actually come to fruition, I think, is a very iffy proposition. I just happened to come back from London 2 days ago, and I was talking to a friend of mine who's a member of parliament and also a Tory politician who's about as right-wing as folks here at AEI. And when I asked about the shale gas exploration issue, he said, no way over everybody's dead body. This is just not going to happen. And the reason is similar to what's also a problem in much of Europe, which is, or all of Europe for that matter, which is the minimal rights for the gas belongs to the state and not individuals. And so people want to know why it is that you're going to disturb their bucolic farmland and lifestyle with this drilling when they're not really going to get any receipts, revenues from doing so. So in addition, of course, many of these countries lack the infrastructure and the corporate competitive structure that we have in the U.S. to be able to pull this off. So, can Europe help itself with its own domestic supplies? I think the answer is fairly pessimistic. Now, that said, and I just want to, and I'm not going to go into detail because I thought Tim did a pretty good job of laying things out. The reality is, while the national governments have been slow to sort of fix many of their gas supply problems, the EU Commission has done a decent job. Again, it's been a long, drawn-out process that began really began in the late 1980s to attempt to liberalize the energy sector in the continent. But thankfully, or maybe not so thankfully, in 2006 and 2009, and now Putin has given the Commission more legitimacy to push forward these liberalization efforts. And so as a result, as Tim noted, there is a more integrated market in Western Europe. There's increased storage capacity. Interconnectors have been built. Reverse flow gas pipelines is now possible. And LNG terminals have been built. And as also was mentioned in the previous panel, the EU Commission has stepped in and told Bulgaria to stop the construction of the South Stream pipeline, at least in its territory, as a violation of EU regulations having to do with anti-competition rules. And also, of course, they're attempting to investigate the deals that were cut to build the pipeline, which seemed to go into the pockets of friends of Mr. Putin. But all that said, again, as Tim already pointed out, Central and Eastern Europe still has problems. When they've been joining the EU, one of the first things that the EU told them is you got to decommission your nuclear plants. And by the way, we have these environmental rules that we would like you to follow, which means we want you to get out of the coal burning business. And so the result was this greater dependency on Russian gas. So there was the conflict within the EU itself over what took priority, whether it was climate issues or energy security, and for at least until recently, at least for Central and Eastern Europe, it's been climate over security. So bottom line, it's a mixed picture. There's not much to be done in helping Europe's own production, but the reality is Europe is still a very large market, even though, as Anders pointed out, it's a somewhat stagnant market, but it's still a large market. And if liberalized, energy costs can be reduced and energy security increased. If this all happens, which again is an open question, there'll be a steady reduction in volumes of contracted gas. As these long-term contracts come up, there'll be less inclination to renew them. And there will actually be more of a market for spot gas purchases. And you're already seeing that in the case of, for example, the LNG terminals that are going to come online this year with Poland and Lithuania. While it's true, as Tim said, that the Polish gas that's being imported from Qatar is connected to oil price index. I think that's only about a third of the gas. The rest of the gas will be spot market priced. And in the case of Lithuania, I think there is no long-term contracts. I think it's all going to be spot. And the result was that because of that, the Russians actually have stepped in and reduced their own price to the Lithuanians, who are 100% dependent upon Russian gas, by about 30%. So we're already seeing some impact on Russian behavior because of these steps. So all the major players see, I think, this situation coming where, again, we have a large market, less and less contracts, and more spot. But the issue is the first ins will have a decided advantage with supplies growing, because once you're first in and these supplies, natural gas, are increasing, it's going to be increasingly unlikely that those who follow are going to be able to convince themselves that the financial risks of these billions of dollars necessary to build plants and do the transportation will be worth it, because the margins, once these supplies do come online, the margins for shipping LNG from the United States or North America to Europe will obviously decrease, and they will also decrease for Asia as well. So if you're not first in, it's going to be harder and harder to convince the financial people that there's a play to be made here. Russia knows this, and this is where I guess I differ a little bit with Tim, which is I'm not so sure Russia, at least, is so confident that it's got this market cornered for the next, in the out years, 4 or 5 years from now. Because at least the way the Russians are behaving, they're acting as though it's very much at risk. They're rushing around trying to get new pipeline deals set. They're moving to try to get into the Asian market to mitigate whatever more reduced market they have from Europe. They're taking baby steps, as Anders said, to liberalize their own gas markets. And they're renegotiating pricing. And as also was suggested, they're tossing around a hell of a lot of cash to politicians and environmental groups to hinder this diversification and shale gas development. So again, there's obviously some disagreement about what Russia's position vis-a-vis Europe is going to be in the years ahead, but at least from the Russian point of view, it appears that they're very much worried about it. So the game is afoot, and so how has the U.S. responded? Well, like the EU, it's been a very much mixed picture, as Gary, I think, laid out quite well. I won't repeat the points he's made, mostly because we do want to get out for the game, but just a couple of small points. Gary mentioned the bill in Congress, with H.R. 6. In fact, it passed yesterday afternoon. And instead of a 90-day limit on the review process after the FERC decides that it's environmentally okay for an LNG plant to be built, that got reduced to 30 days, which is really quite remarkable turnaround if it was actually to become into law. In the Senate, you have Senators Udall and Landrieu, who both are up for re-election and running very hard competitive races. They have a version of the bill, and they call for a 45-day limit to review after FERC approval. Now, if you take a look at the vote in the House, while there were, I think, about 45 Democrats who voted for the bill, the overwhelming number of Democrats in the House voted against H.R. 6. So if you're like me and you've been in this town for 30 years, you would probably assess that the chances of the Udall-Landrieu bill, A, getting to the floor for a vote are probably, A, small, and passage probably even smaller. So I suppose the good news is that a year and a half ago, you would not have gotten any of these bills even to be considered. So that's the good news. The bad news is they're not likely to become law. So we'll be left with an Obama administration, as Gary suggested, that's just a little bit pregnant about all these matters. Now, I just want one final point, which I'm always kind of struck by, maybe because I'm just not a trade expert, but the current laws that we have on the back strike me, just on the fair reading of them, as being in violation of our obligations under the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the GATT, particularly Article 11, which prohibits a discrimination between WTO members about this kind of exporting. You're only allowed to discriminate for two reasons. One is because it's a natural resource that's exhaustible, and national emergencies. On the exhaustion exemption, you would have to be taking steps to sort of conserve that particular resource. But the reality is we're going great guns producing that and using that natural gas. So on its face, we're not abiding by the exception rule. And then, of course, in a national emergency, we're not in a national emergency. That commonsensically means that you're at war or there's a massive crisis of some sort. So weirdly, even though we've gone and sued China twice now in WTO for doing with rare earths and metals what we're in fact on the books for doing for natural gas, we seem to be remarkably hypocritical about this. Now, the reason why, and we've won, by the way, in those two cases. Now, the reason why nobody has challenged the U.S., obviously, is that our allies are scared to do so. Japan wants our natural gas, and the last thing it wants to do is pick a fight about over GAD at this particular point in time. It's hoping that these 7 to 14 to 20 or whatever LNG plants get built, much of that gas will go to it and to South Korea. But nevertheless, it would be nice if at least somebody sued us to force open this issue. And I was in Europe recently when the tapes of the Polish foreign minister were released, where he commented that the transatlantic relationship with the U.S. for Poles was worthless. So I think I'm going to reach out to Radek and ask him, since it is worthless, and go ahead and start suing us, so we can get this game afoot more strongly when it comes to exporting LNG to Europe and Asia. Thanks.
Thank you, Gary. Before we open it up for questions, does anybody on the panel want to offer any additional comments or reactions? Okay. All right, well, let's open it up for questions then. Please state your name and your affiliation. Okay.
Adam Gustafson at Boyd & Gray & Associates. I'm interested in this problem, Gary, that you've identified between this divergence between U.S. policy, where the landowner owns the rights underneath his land, and the European policy, which is the opposite. And I'm wondering if there have been any ideas or proposals to change that. It sounds like in the UK it's been more community-oriented with these building projects you've described, but I wonder if there's been anything more landowner-oriented, or if you have any proposals.
I've literally not seen anybody. I mean, when I bring this up, you know, all my European politician friends just nod, and it's just that's true. And then you ask them whether or not there's any likelihood that they could ever change the law on that, and they nod and go this way. So I just haven't seen anything. I mean, in the UK, it's just, I mean, you know, those of you who've, you know, walked, you know, variety of, you know, paths in England, you realize, you know, so even if a farmer has a, you know, a piece of land, everybody's tromping across it hiking. It's sort of just, the land is thought to be sort of, even though, you know, property rights are his, there's a kind of a communal sense that the thing belongs to everybody, or in this case, mineral rights belong to the crown, exactly. But I've seen no progress on it, and even for countries that are like Poland, which are, at least in theory, were originally more market oriented, and that just made no effort to change this at all.
Laura Marslisi, U.S. Azeri Network. So SOCAR, which is the Azerbaijani state oil company, as I'm sure you know, is supposed to complete its TANAP pipeline from Baku to Europe by the end of this year, actually. And I'm wondering what you think the repercussions will be on the natural gas market in Europe, specifically with regards to Russia's stake, and what the repercussions might be, political or otherwise, in the Caucasus region.
So the TAP pipeline, you said, right? Yeah, okay. So, well, I mean, the initial capacity, I think the first supplies are actually expected in 2018, but maybe they come earlier. The capacity initially is 10 BCM. So, beg your pardon?
It can go, I mean...
No, so, well, okay, no. The initial capacity is 10 BCM, and there are plans that it may be upgraded if market, you know, forces would allow it to 30. But it's all theoretical. What we have is 10 BCM that is contracted and will flow from 2018. That is a very welcome and helpful supply, of course. It doesn't change the gas market in Europe fundamentally.
One footnote: gas, though, is also going to be price is going to be tagged to the oil price, and so in that sense, it's in terms of economics, it's not all that much more helpful when it comes to reducing costs. And again, it won't be if it remains tied to the oil, The idea that it could be expanded, I think, is going to be less likely because by that time there'll be a lot more spot oil on the international market.
Somebody mentioned the Mediterranean fields.
Can you use the mic? Oh, yeah.
Bronco Terzic again. One of you mentioned the Mediterranean fields. I think you're talking about Tamar and Leviathan off of Cyprus. What are the time frames for that? And at one time there was talk about a Nabucco line. Nobody talks about that anymore. Is that dead?
So the Eastern Mediterranean, offshore Israel, 2 significant fields have been found. Tamar is producing. I think it's about 10 or 12 TCF, if I'm not mistaken. Leviathan is a little bigger. It's not on stream. Actually, the Australian company that was interested to, that was looking into whether they could reach an agreement to export LNG from that part of the world, pulled out. And is not staying. And I was in Israel just last week, came back last Thursday, and policymakers have shifted, interestingly, their thoughts about selling this as LNG to exploring regional options, which makes much more sense economically, of course, if only the politics would allow for a pipeline to be built, which is not a given in this part of the world. But I think I would expect that in due time, some form of agreement with Turkey could be reached. There's a lot of private sector interest on both sides to do this. And what I understand is that Erdogan is in a difficult spot now with the presidential election cycle, but once that's over, it's not unlikely that there will be some form of agreement. But you would have to construct a subsea pipeline still, because you can't go through Syria and Lebanon, making it more expensive, challenging, and it has to go through Cypriot EEZ. Which is, of course, another issue that needs to be addressed then. So I think all in all, there's promise, there's supplies, there's some supplies offshore Cyprus as well, of course, although those are, I think all in all, my conclusion now would be they're regionally potentially very significant if these states can somehow collaborate and share their resource. Some of it may go to Europe, but I think that, I think that the expectations of that are somewhat inflated, and it remains to be seen how much is really competitive in Europe. And the time frame, we're talking, not by the end of this decade at the earliest. And as for Nabucco, I think that, it was competing, of course, with the TAP TANAP project. It was a politically motivated pipeline. It went through areas which we talked about that have the least interconnection, that are most vulnerable to supply disruptions. But the markets are very small, and so I was not that surprised that market forces dictated that TAP TANAP would be more interesting to bring that gas to Italy, which is actually a large market, makes much more sense commercially. And so I don't think that there's a lot of hope that Nabucco will get built.
Anybody else? Well, I guess we can maybe close out early. Thanks again to Tim and Gary, and thanks again to Ben Zeiker for helping put this together, and thank you for coming to AEI.